Corsair Clockworks, Chapter 4, in which a day of shopping takes a wrong turn. Sails. The structure of the wood, internally reinforced by braces. Numbers, notations, and figures. Weight ratios and wind currents. Flashes of diagrams, repeating, cycling, coiling in on themselves until forming a majestic, many-sailed ship. It rose into the air, in the void in which Andrea found herself. However, as she stood beneath the massive vessel, studied its curves and planks, the lines of windows, the complex netting of rigging, the sturdy prow, and lining the keel great lifting cylinders, she only saw familiarity. She was an observer, but also a part of the ship. She knew it, like a mother knows her child. Her lips parted in two soft words. "I understand." Blearily, Andrea awoke in her bed, her long hair an awkward mess and strands clinging to her lips. She spat them out and gradually pulled herself to a sitting position. Across the room, Julia still slept soundly, despite the early morning rays drifting in through the window. Mother would more than likely be along to wake them shortly, but Andrea, while still groggy, was quite awake. That was strange, she thought as she forced herself out of bed. She dressed for the day, choosing a deep green dress styled like an ankle-long, flared waistcoat that would fit over a long-sleeved, light green shirt and loose tie. Julia finally began to grudgingly awaken, though only made whining noises. Andrea shook her head and pinned up her hair. The dream was still at the front of her mind as she went down the stairs. She supposed the airship she had seen yesterday had stuck with her. Considering how much had happened the day before, it was more strange that the airship had been the most notable. It wasn't even as though she had never seen an airship. Surely the mage at her window, or the message that had burned a nice hole through her vanity were more noteworthy. Even being held back after school, or the unfortunate decapitation of father's mechanical bird. Of course, in her own mind, she would have been much happier to have a dream about Alan Ventaris. In the kitchen, a pot of hot cereal waited on the stove, and Andrea served herself a bowl. While she ate, her mind drifted back to Alan, and his deeply kind smile. That moment just before the mage had interrupted them. Just where might their conversation have taken them? "Andrea," her mother's voice began. "Mama?" Her mother stood beside her and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. A rare occurrence, her mother seemed at a loss for words. Several times she tried to speak, but only sighed heavily. She then sat at the table beside Andrea, smoothing out her blue-flowered dress and idly moving aside the single braid she held her hair in that day. "I know you're not fond of serious topics when you're not having to go to school, but I feel as though there's something we should talk about alone." Andrea uneasily placed her hands in her lap and fidgeted. All right." She pondered her words a moment longer, then cleared her throat gently. "Your father was upset about yesterday afternoon and what happened at dinner. He believes I'm being overly harsh on you." It was highly doubtful Mother wanted her to jump in to agree, so she remained silent. "Perhaps I didn't make my intentions clear," she offered. What do you mean?" "I don't mean to bring down your spirits, dear, but you are 17 now." I know," she murmured, as her mother would not stop reminding her. "Your father means nothing but the best for you and Julia," she began gently, "but I don't think he fully understands the change from girl into woman, and what girlish things must be left behind. You're much too old to still be playing in your father's work, and too old to be chasing after a noble's son." A violent blush came to her, and she shrank in on herself. But I didn't. It was just an accident." I know, she said quickly, holding up a hand. "It was just chance, and it was incredibly kind of Sir Ventaris to guide you home." She then stared meaningfully into Andrea's eyes. "But to hope for anything more than that chance meeting is only fancy. You know that." It was a rude intrusion of reality into her daydreams since the night before. Andrea's shoulders slumped, and she stared into her lap in deep shame. It wasn't fair that her mother could guess her thoughts so easily, or that it was so easy to steal them away. Now, don't be ashamed," she continued in a gentle voice. "We all have our girlish fantasies. When I was a girl, I was certain I would run away and become a Khitanese princess." At this, Andrea raised her head and lowered an eyebrow incredulously. Hearing such an inflated fantasy out of her mother's lips was a shock. She also couldn't help but grimace at the thought of her mother in red and gold silks, being poured some exotic tea by a black-haired Khitanese servant. Perhaps rings on every finger, and her nails sharp and painted. Oh, goodness no, she couldn't even imagine with a straight face. When Andrea giggled lightly, her mother half smiled, showing how absurd she found the suggestion as well. "Silly as it sounds now, I was so sure it would happen. I planned how I would save my money, find a ship. The point is, Andrea," she paused, propping her elbows on the table and forming her fingers into a steeple. "I then met your father, and I left aside my dreams. His dreams became mine." A glow appeared on her face as she closed her eyes and smiled warmly. "And not once have I ever regretted it." She opened her eyes and turned in her seat toward Andrea. "Don't miss the beautiful things right before your eyes, because you're too busy chasing fancies." Seeing the affection in her mother's eyes caused Andrea to sink into her chest and embrace her tightly. "I love you dearly," Mama whispered gently. "I'm sorry I make you worry so," Andrea mumbled into her. "I'll worry a good deal less when you're not greasing up your fingers with your father's tools, and rather enjoying things more suited for a lady," she said with a chuckle while stroking her shoulders. She leaned back from her mother and smiled sheepishly. "I try, I do." "It's Julia's turn to help in the shop, Andrea," Mama began while standing. She motioned for Andrea to follow and led her back upstairs. They passed by Julia as she rushed to the kitchen to grab whatever might still be warm. "Go fetch your purse, dear," Mother said to Andrea. When Andrea stepped out of the room holding her green and gold bag, Mother produced a handful of coins from her dress pockets with a smile. "Why don't you go out? Find something for yourself, something feminine. A new shawl, some shoes. Perhaps something for your hair would strike you. You have such long, lovely hair, dear. Just spend the day reveling in being a lady. Who knows? You might find it to your liking." Andrea took Mother's words to heart. With a spring in her step, she walked through the main streets of Saint-Emile. All around her, the street corners were filled with activity. The carts sported clerks and fine folks, while horse-drawn carts drove sellers and wares toward the market lanes. The noises rang through her head joyously. A beautiful symphony of trotting hooves, hissing and clanking machines, and the daytime chatter of shoppers, children playing, commuters, and merchants. At last she reached her destination, Carver's Boutique, a cozy shop Andrea had been eyeing for some time. The ladies who owned the parlor were sellers of accessories, dresses, hats, and fine combs in particular. Laid out under glass were gorgeous pieces, most of wood or bone, but several in multicolored, polished metal. It was one of these that Andrea was instantly drawn to, a strong, varnished-looking comb with an intricate design of a silver crescent moon crossing a multi-beamed, gold-tinted sun. It reminded her of the Corsair music boxes in a way, the metal solid, yet delicate in the manner of the piece's inner workings. It was a perfect fit for her. Mrs. Carver brushed out the tight braids that had been holding Andrea's hair, and with masterful hands she swept, rolled, and pulled Andrea's formidable locks. With the insertion of the comb, the hairstyle stayed in perfect place. Andrea gazed at herself in the boutique's mirror, Mrs. Carver smiling sweetly as she held up a hand mirror to allow Andrea to see the back. Brightly Andrea glowed, and within moments the comb had been purchased, and Andrea was all but skipping back out into the streets. Her feet were lighter against the stone. It was a rare moment she felt truly striking. With her very smart dress, heeled boots, and glistening comb, she was utterly transformed. She honestly felt her years, a young lady of ripe courting age, and yet today she cared not for any gaze other than her own as she passed by tall windows. The prior day was all but forgotten, and she walked straight and tall down the sidewalk past pedestrians. Despite their disagreements, Mother had absolutely been right. There was something magical in appreciating one's appearance, even if only a few moments. She dreamily pondered what else she should do that day. Perhaps there would be performers near the market square. She thought she saw several packing up instruments and such the night before. Or maybe she would buy a treat to nibble on and simply walk in the fresh air. It was a lovely day, with a fresh breeze and a cloudless sky. Again she allowed herself to be swept up in the commotion of Saint Emile. She listened as she walked, imagining it all as an orchestra. Few would find it more than noise, but if one heard just right, then the lyrical dance of pitch and rhythm could be marked. Wagons, speech. As she lightly strolled past several buildings, she even heard a foreign accent. It was rare to hear anything other than perfect Garlish this far inland, and so it was a welcome addition to the melody, an unexpected solo as she focused on the three voices. "Has not delivered the message yet, Ramsay," a young, tired man's voice said. A second, older man replied, this one in flawless pronunciation, odd only in its clinical precision. "Good. He still believes he has lost us, then." "He has remained in clear sight, though," the first added. "It doesn't matter," the second said firmly. "Where is he?" A final voice spoke, this one gruff, gravelly, and heavy in the weight of years. He also found trouble with even the shortest of Garlish words. "In the square, only bird fit him." The second punctuated with, "We'll be done before a soul notices, then we can leave this infection of a city." As she heard the exchange, the dreamy, serene smile left her, replacing it with an ashen expression that followed a tremble down her spine. She didn't change her pace as she passed the alley, and she struggled to dredge up her smile and maintain the cheerful tune she'd been humming. As she passed, she caught the barest of shapes in the darkness, the three men staring into the light from the shadows. Remaining inconspicuous was surely impossible for them. While she couldn't make out much without staring right at them and drawing their attention, she did note that all three of them had their heads completely shaved and sported eye patches over their left eyes. All three of them. Left eye patches. It didn't seem they suspected her having heard. Her hearing was much sharper than normal, after all. No one else would have picked up on the low, murmuring voices they had used. While she didn't know exactly what these clearly unscrupulous men were talking about, she had an idea. A man with a message and a bird. To her, that description fit only one man in all of Saint Emile. And up ahead in the next square, she could see that very man sitting on the edge of a fountain. The young journeyman she had met the night before was nearly as conspicuous as those shadowing him. In the early summer, mid-morning heat, he was still wearing his heavy, navy-colored cloak. He sat casually on the lip of the square's fountain, difficult as it was to appear casual when a bird of prey sat next to him, eagerly swallowing bits of meat he offered. A small blanket was spread over his lap, bits of bread, cheese, and meat on it, and a bottle beside him. "And good morning, Magus," she announced herself as she approached. A large, forced smile spread across her face. He said nothing as she neared, though she noted a large roll of his eyes. "Didn't you have a message to deliver?" she continued, her hands clutched in front of her tightly. "The guardhouse, was it? Did you already do that?" Tight-lipped, the young man cocked an eyebrow and gestured a hand toward a building nearby. It bore the seal of the Saint Emile Guard, and two men in uniform flanked its doors. "Oh, of course. Right over there. Now, why exactly aren't you there right now?" she pressed, her smile only growing larger and exposing more teeth. He allowed a point to the food in his lap to serve as his answer. Even Pascal, his avian familiar, glared at her mirthlessly. Apparently nothing other than spelling things out for him was going to work. What a bull-headed man. Her smile dropped, her eyes burned into his, and she hissed through clenched teeth, "And you didn't notice you were being followed?" Finally his expression changed, his eyes jolting open and his jaw going slack. In a flurry of movement, he had gathered the food in the folds of the blanket, and his gaze darted all over the entrances and exits to the square. "How many?" he said in a hushed voice, pulling out his wand from a holster at its side. "3. He pointed the wand at the bundle, and it all vanished. Andrea nearly started. She had never seen so much magic waved around so casually before. Theatrically, yes, but never as though mundane. "Shaved heads," he pressed. She nodded. "With eye patches," he finished for her, his face growing tense. "Toss me in the pits." He stood and looked around the square again. "Pascal," he said to his bird. "Stay close." The bird responded to his spoken command by shaking out its wings and taking off. "Thought I lost them a week ago," the journeyman muttered under his breath, quite sure Andrea couldn't hear him. Is this about those men from last night?" she whispered, put on edge by his tension. "Hardly," he said low. "Those were just street rabble. Running into them and you was nothing more than chance." Andrea let out a tiny sound when the journeyman gripped her wrist without warning and began walking toward the guardhouse. "These men are trained killers, and they're most likely watching and have seen you with me." Stunned, Andrea tried to stammer out more than, "What?" "I said before, the message I carry is of dire importance to the Empire and its allies," he reminded her. "These men have followed me all the way from the front." The journeyman walked forward, Andrea in tow, his eyes locked onto the gates of the guardhouse and the 2 soldiers in front of it. "No matter how hard I tried to shake them, fly through the night, these Nurgovod snakes hounded me, afforded me little sleep." How close the distance had been. Less than a block, from the center of the square to its perimeter. Yet between the time it took for the Magus to begin speaking until the 2 were nearly 50 feet from the doors of the guardhouse, a figure strode with square shoulders and rested in their path. His posture was straight and powerful. He wore a caped, heavy coat that made his form all the more imposing. Black hunting boots and a pair of sturdy navy pants contrasted against a red vest and cravat that would have looked better suited on a clerk than someone with such military bearing. He was nearing middle age, with heavy lines between his hard brow and sharp cheekbones, casting shadows over his square face and his single, piercing blue eye. Most striking, of course, was his completely shaved head and the patch covering his left eye. "And now we have to find another way around," the Magus said, turning his sentence midway as he gripped tighter on Andrea and led her to the side. A frightened yelp escaped her at this sudden jerk, and she abruptly found herself running to keep up with her escort's rushed steps. With the barest of glances their movement afforded her, she could see the man follow their pace, and she could distantly hear the confusion of the guards that had seen the occurrence in front of their stations. One tried to order the lot of them to stop, and Andrea would have loved to do so, but something in the mage's desperation spoke volumes about the shimmer of violence she had seen in their pursuer's eye. It's broad daylight," she gasped out, suddenly struck by how seemingly senseless the man's unspoken threat had been. "Directly in front of the city guard!" As the Magus guided her into a side alley, she could hear him mumbling about how little that man cared for subtlety. She also caught a low, "But where are the other 2? Beginning to already tire of running, Andrea tugged back at her wrist. "What would they even want with me?" "Do you ever stay quiet?" was her harsh response, along with a look to her, the kind she might give to her sister if Julia interrupted her work. Steps caused her to jump, and the Magus reacted to her instantly. 2 men appeared from behind a building, faces easily matching the youngest and oldest voices she recalled hearing. The younger of them was she in the Magus's age, thin and wiry, awkward in a drab work shirt and vest, and breeches. His eye was dull, not only in its color, but also from the dark circle underneath it. "Foolish to run," he breathed out in a voice as tired as his eyes. The final man said nothing, and served as the younger man's mountainous shadow. While the first had not been small by any means, this man was all but a giant compared to both of his companions. His shape was more like a brick building than a man, sturdy and towering, made even more so by the dark green caped coat he wore. His brow was heavy and thick, much like the shaggy, richly brown eyebrows his eye peered from under. Gray lined these, the only hint at what his hair may have once been. As he leveled a one-eyed stare at Andrea and the Magus, an emptiness suddenly appeared in it, and it began to widen with a bestial hunger. Both were there for blood, and sturdy, frightening daggers rested in their hands. Andrea's breath halted in her throat, her legs froze and trembled. The mage was much faster on his feet, and he pushed Andrea back as the younger of the 2 dashed forward with a swipe of the blade. The Magus thrust his wand in the direction of the smaller man, and a crackle of atmosphere was followed by a flash of light and a loud snap. The assailant was thrown back against the cobblestone, and for a moment his limbs were trapped in the position he had held them when struck. She had no time for cheering or amazement, as a heavy shadow fell over she and the Magus, and the larger of them raised his arm. She was struck dumb by his size, and how small she was in comparison. A hare watching a bear raise its paw to strike with a snarl. A high-pitched shriek interrupted her terror, and a flutter of wings was all at once between her and her ursine attacker. Pascal hovered over his face, cawing, and his taloned feet swiping at him. A flurry of a rolling, guttural language Andrea couldn't hope to comprehend flowed out of the man's mouth as he swatted at the air to get Pascal back. While the smaller of the assailants struggled to stand, and the larger struggled with Pascal, the Magus heaved from adrenaline. "They've never gotten this close," he whispered. He paused and looked toward the direction he and Andrea had come. The third had entered the alley, staring hard at the Magus, straight through Andrea as though she were air. "Run, miss," the Magus murmured, taking a step back. Her eyes were locked on the man. Time crawled as he flexed his hand and raised his arm. A clearly mechanical sound followed, and Andrea jumped when a long, thick blade jutted from the cuff of his coat. Before she could piece together what by the divine he was carrying, a hand grabbed her wrist, and she was being led by the Magus again. "Just run!" he blurted. "Run now!" He was no longer having to pull her, though he was a much better runner than herself. Her heart pounded through her ears, while the last few moments jumbled together in her mind to form into a picture that made actual sense. Those men are going to kill us both!" she gasped out, though the words were difficult to grasp as reality. With a firm resolve, her escort replied, "No, not so long as I can get us back to the guardhouse. There must be a way to loop around. Another entrance." "Why did you even take us into the alleys to begin with?" she snapped back. He glanced over his shoulder. In his deep, dark eyes she could see a glimmer of sheepishness. "Impulse. I just need a moment to think of something better." His eyes grew wide, and without even stopping, he thrust out his wand hand in her direction. Thankfully, she was able to keep running without being startled by the sudden motion. A snap of bitter cold shot directly by her shoulder, and she allowed herself a brief glance behind her. The youngest of the assassins was the fastest of the three, and he had nearly reached them, his knife at the ready. A spell lashed into a nearby rain barrel, and it burst in a shower of icy shards. He shielded his good eye from the slivers, and she and the Magus were able to make more distance around a corner. The Magus let out a frustrated grunt to see the turn had only taken them into more empty alleys. Do they never end? "They're coming!" Andrea rushed out in reminder. Clearly agitated, the Magus gritted his teeth. "Fine!" he snapped back. Ribbons of blue energy surrounded his wand and hand, and he pointed at a nearby wall. A door appeared, pristine, with sanded and painted panels and a polished doorknob. Andrea gawked at the new portal and at the Magus as he put his hand to the knob to open it. But where does it go?" she asked. Thinking something like, "Anywhere is better than here," was irresponsible. This was magic after all. "Through the wall. Where else?" he replied with a shrug. On the other side of the door was a hall and a home. Framed silhouettes hung from the papered walls. She followed her escort, and as soon as he closed the door behind her, he waved, and it vanished without a trace. "There. Now they can't follow." For a moment the two caught their breaths, but it was only the shortest of moments. The Magus gestured for Andrea to keep pace, and they ran through the home. It was a very comfortable one, clean floorboards, lovingly worn furniture, and they passed a collection of plates arranged in a cupboard. While they moved, she heard the Magus muttering under his breath, trying to piece together where they must have gone, and which direction would lead them back to the guard's headquarters. Andrea heard a sharp gasp, and her head snapped to lock eyes with an elderly woman. The frail woman had a hand over her mouth, and she blinked at them in shock. "My goodness!" "I'm so sorry," Andrea blurted as the Magus took hold of her wrist again, and they darted into the parlor. The Magus waved the wand, and Andrea yanked back at him. "What are you doing? The front door is this way." "Wrong direction," he mumbled, causing another door to appear. "This way," he said, ignoring her arguments to the contrary. The two went through, and as soon as it closed, they were in a run again. Andrea groaned in bewilderment when she saw the Magus had no intention of causing the intrusive portal to disappear. "You've broken that poor woman's house," she cried. His eyes focused ahead of them. The Magus countered, "The guild will compensate for any damages. There. Happy?" The other side of the door was an extensive garden surrounded by walls, the sort clearly owned by someone of consequence. While some berries climbed lattice against the wall, the majority of the plants were brightly colored flowers. Ornamentation over pragmatism. The pair rushed by a gardener, who only stared at them blankly as the Magus created another doorway and pulled them through. Andrea yanked on his wrist this time, and he heaved out a sigh and caused the doorway to vanish. "Wasting our time," he grumbled. "It's polite, and there's no sign of them." At this he stared at her, jaw slack. He shook his head and led her on through the new set of back streets they had entered. As they moved, the Mage's eyes lit up. "Perfect! Look! I knew we were close, and there is a side entrance." Sure enough, on a building a short distance away was the city guard's seal. It was a brief bit of relief, as Andrea noted the empty alleys around them. "But there's no one here. Not a soul around." "We're fine," the mage assured her as they walked now. "We lost the Nurgovod's trail. He paused in mid-step, and his face sank. His change in expression caused Andrea's shoulders to tense. Oh, surely not. She slowly turned to look down the street, and she instinctively gripped the mage's cloak. Turning a corner and running at full speed toward them were all three of the men, the three eyes between them locked onto she and the magus. The journeyman took hold of her hand, and they were running again. It was a short sprint to the door of the building, but a tug at the door showed it firmly locked. "No," he gasped out. "No! Open this door! In the name of the journeyman, open this door!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, beating against the wood with his fist. "Magus?" Andrea stammered, her hand clenching the cloak around his shoulders desperately. Her eyes were fixed on their impending doom, the three men drawing closer. The younger led them, his feet light against the cobblestone and his stance low, ready to leap. At the back was the largest, that savage hunger in his eye, and the one wearing the black cloak between them. While Andrea had not seen expression of any kind on this man as of yet, his face twisted in rage to see them so close to escape, and he let out a furious howl. The wide blade protruding from his right cuff glinted in the light, as did something metallic in his left. "Magus, please!" Andrea all but sobbed. "A door! Anything!" He shook his head wildly, indicating for some reason this was impossible. He then looked back to the assailants. "They're on us. Give me your hand." What? He grabbed Andrea's hand and pulled something out of a pouch on his belt. He shoved a ring on her finger. "This will protect you." The middle of the Nurgovod didn't allow any more time before he swung his left arm fluently. Andrea barely saw flashes in the light, and she covered her face but only heard a dull thunk and a clatter of metal on the pavement. Knives had been thrown at them. This she knew from the scream her companion let out. His head jerked back, and he fell to his knees, a hand fumbling around his ribcage. He collapsed on the stone, red filling his shirt, and a horrific cry lodged in Andrea's throat. Somehow she was all right, yet this young man would die at her feet. Distantly she was aware the door finally opened, and men in red and white uniforms ran out. One knelt beside the shuddering magus, another placed a hand on her shoulder. This gentle touch, a question if she was all right, and all at once her vision grew blurry. Everything was heavy, and she sagged into the soldier's arms. All was black.
Corsair Clockworks is an Ever Tomorrow production, plot by Jessie Lynn Jones and Marlon de Rivera, and written and performed by Jessie Lynn Jones. For more audio fiction, click the links and subscribe today so you'll always be ready for the next chapter.